Finally, we're up to what is in fact a clade within the green plants, the seed plants. They are defined by a synapomorphy, the presence of actual seeds. They have evolved a solution for one of the last problems that faced terrestrial plants. Um, One of the difficulties that organisms have in the terrestrial environment is reproduction. In order for a male gamete to fertilize a female gamete, the two cells have to meet. The actual sperm cell has to have access to the membrane of the egg cell. But if these are open to the air, both of these cells are going to desiccate. So you have to have, if you're going to reproduce in truly dry environments, you have to have some kind of structure that prevents these cells from desiccating and yet allows them to meet. This is a real problem for living out on land, and it's something that has only, for which solutions have only evolved a small number of times throughout the 3.5 billion years of life's history. The solutions to this problem and the problem of how to keep embryos from drying out occurred around 270 million years ago. And for the first time, you have the entire surface of the Earth blanketed with green growing things. First, gymnosperms arose, and then were later supplanted by angiosperms. We'll be talking about those groups both in a minute. The gymnosperms are the older of the two groups. They may or may not be a clade, also themselves. But even though there are only about 600 species, they dominate certain environments, particularly boreal environments, that is, areas that are far to the north. Also, high alpine environments, areas that are high up in altitude, are dominated by gymnosperms, which you recognize mostly as conifers. Conifers are a subset of the gymnosperms. Things like pine trees, spruce trees, fir trees, and a few other related groups belong in the gymnosperms. They are all trees or large shrubs. Some of them are extremely long-lived. Some of them can live to something like 5,000 years old. The leaves on most of them are very narrow. They're needles that don't fall off during the winter, at least not in most gymnosperms. The reason for having these very thin needles is that they reduce water loss during the winter. The major threat to terrestrial plants during the winter is actually not physical freezing. It's the water loss that occurs when liquid water, is locked up as ice. A plant can dehydrate and die surrounded by snow. One thing that you are certainly familiar with about the gymnosperms is that they carry their seeds in cones. Most individual plants carry both male and female cones. The innovation which these plants have that allowed them to reproduce out on land is the pollen grain. Cones produce, male cones at least, produce pollen. And this is actually a small organism. It's an organism all to itself called a gametophyte. But it's so tiny that most of them are almost microscopic. All of these are pollen grains magnified 1,000 times. And their job is essentially to drift through the air, at least in the gymnosperms, until they encounter a female, a receptive female gametophyte. Those structures are also held inside the cones of gymnosperms. Seeds are an innovation that protects developing embryos from desiccation. And they allow the new generation, basically the tiny embryonic plant, to disperse to new environments. I'm not going to get into the many different ways that seeds are dispersed, but there are a number of ingenious innovations that plants have evolved over the millennia in order to get themselves to new habitats. One thing I do want to note about the gymnosperms is that they are all wind pollinated. That is, when they release pollen, they have to rely on air currents to take those pollen grains to receptive female gametophytes, to receptive female cones. This is incredibly inefficient, particularly for if you've got a species that is relatively rare or individuals are relatively spread out from one another, because you have to release massive clouds of pollen in order to guarantee that some of them will reach a receptive cone of an individual of the same species. This isn't a particularly good shot, but you can see clouds of pollen, if you squint here anyway, you can see clouds of pollen coming off of the male cones on this conifer. Each one of those pollen grains is a fully developed organism in its own right. Each one costs nutrients and energy to build, and most of them, the vast majority of them, are completely wasted because they'll never happen to encounter a receptive female cone. This is where the angiosperms come in. The angiosperms are the flowering plants, and flowers are an adaptation to allow pollination to occur more readily. The angiosperms have been incredibly successful, such that they now dominate practically all terrestrial environments. Their female reproductive structure is, the female cells are called ovules. They're enclosed in a structure called a carpel, which eventually develops into a structure that is called a fruit. In botanical terms, fruit is a term that doesn't just refer to things like apples and oranges. It refers to any seed-bearing structure of a flowering plant. The advantage of having flowers is that if you can convince animals to come and visit a particular kind of flower, you can exploit their ability to move and behave in sophisticated ways. What flowers do is they offer some kind of reward for animals that come and move to land on a flower and then move to another flower of the same species. And usually this reward is in the form of nectar or sugar water, although some animals also feed on pollen. Animals are very good at moving around in their environment and searching for particular goals. And when plants evolved to make their flowers into desirable goals, they hit on a mechanism of using animals to transport their pollen directly from a flower of one species to the flower on another individual of the same species. This makes pollination much, much more efficient, and it is certainly one of the reasons for the ascendance and dominance of the angiosperms among the plant kingdom. Different pollinators are drawn to different kinds of flowers. Many flowers have evolved so that they draw one or maybe a few pollinator species, and this also increases the efficiency with which pollen is transferred among flowers of the same species. The structure of a flower is something like this. The reproductive cells themselves are here in the middle, the ovules. The sepals, the petals, then the anthers here, and finally the stigma in the center, are all derived from leaves. It's just that they have become, their structures have evolved so they now serve a very different purpose. Pollination occurs in the flowering plants when a pollen grain released from the anther of one individual lands on the stigma, the receptive female sexual surface of a flower, on either the same individual, if it's capable of self-fertilization, or on a different individual. The ovary here is a watertight container that contains the egg cell, which has already gone through a little bit of division, so it now consists of 7 cells rather, that are together in this tight clump. What will happen is that the pollen grain will stimulate the growth of a pollen tube that allows the two nuclei in the pollen grain to move down the pollen tube and into the ovary, then fertilizing the egg and allowing the development of a seed and an embryonic plant. The fruit then grows up from the carpel, the coat around this ovary. The seed grows up from the egg cell, the ovary within, or sorry, the seed grows up from the egg cell and becomes the embryo within that ovary. And basically all seeds have a similar structure to this. The angiosperms really took off about 140 million years ago. By now, there are about 235 million, or 235,000 species, sorry. A remarkable variety both in terms of the number of species and in terms of their physical forms. They possess true vessels, which are modified so that water flows extremely efficiently through their length. Vessels that you see today actually consist of a pair of cells. At least some of the vessels, there is an inner cell which has grown and lost basically all of its organelles. It is now just a hollow tube through which water passes. All of its cellular needs are met by a second cell that's sort of wrapped around the first and, as I said, takes care of all of its needs. These true vessels are only found in angiosperms, and they are more efficient in transporting water than any of the other vascular cells that we've seen so far.